Chapter 11. It was just as though everything was about to die. The small brown birds had deserted the bush, and the bush itself no longer supplied the coverage and protection for the secret activities of the scarlet and golden birds. Here and there faint patches of green clung to the topmost branches of tall thorn trees, but not a green thing survived near the sun-baked earth. The sky had lost that dense blue look of the winter days and spread itself out into a whitish film, through which the sun poured out molten heat in pulsating waves from dawn to dusk. In this desolation the vultures reigned supreme. They gathered on the ground in huge flocks of 60 to 100 and held important discussions in hoarse, rough voices, and flapped their long, sloppy brown feathers in imperious indignation. They could afford to be imperious, indignant, and important, for they were to be a burial society for over 600,000 cattle. They were amazed, and wondering if they could manage it all, or if they should send messages to fellow brethren in Africa and India. But whatever their deliberations, they were fearless and proud, for these mean, fierce birds knew that they were always the last visitors on a stricken part of the earth. Barely 3 miles away from the village of Cholamamimidi, the impact of all this struck the small party that had left for the cattle post earlier in the morning. During the night, a cow that had belonged to one of the cattlemen had lain down to calf and died in the process. A jackal had hovered near her the whole night, and at dawn set himself to devour the newborn calf. The approach of the Land Rover disturbed him, and he arose and slunk away into the bush. Gilbert slowed down the vehicle near the cow, and his exclamation, "Oh, this is terrible!" hardly conveyed the deep sense of shock Micaiah felt. From that day Micaiah was to become particularly Motswana in his outlook. Coming from a country of green hills and fresh bubbly streams, he was from that day to treasure every green shoot that sprang up in this dry place, and he would fear to waste even a drop of water. Paulina was the only one who was not deeply perturbed by what she saw. She had lived through times like this before, when the bush was bare and the ploughing season delayed indefinitely. To her, it even seemed like an unreal and lovely spring morning, when life was just beginning anew again instead of dying, and her feelings relived over and over again a whole night's dream. He just sat there beside her looking as cool and aloof and unchanged as yesterday, while nothing of her own life was left to her, as though she had become an appendage of his body, like an arm or a leg. It wasn't a pleasant feeling, as no secure promises had been made. On the one hand, a woman distrusted extravagant promises, and, on the other, lived in fear of the silence of a reserved man who only expressed himself in deeds. Maybe women invented marriages, as their imaginations had invented most other things in a man's social life. They can't help saying, "Are you my property? I must own you." And now Paulina busied her mind with these things while the sky and the bush exploded into a hot, white glare of heat. Gilbert turned round and half smiled at all the dreams in the woman's eyes. "Am I still going in the right direction, Paul?" he asked. "The bush is so changed, I can't make out a thing." That is, if he ever had. Like the Tswana language, the bush belonged to all Botswana people, who had created its footpaths and mapped out its length and breadth in their minds. It had often amazed him to discover that cattlemen drove their cattle home, through the bush, in pitch darkness, with an unerring sense of direction, while he, Gilbert, had several times lost his direction within the fenced farmlands, and his legs and arms bore lots of scars from having pitched himself into a barbed wire fence at night. But Paulina had footed it this way every 3 or 4 months to take her son his food rations and see if all was well with him at the cattle post, and not so long ago the call of birds had filled these empty spaces. They were always after something, these lovely birds, and she had always kept corn seed in the pocket of her skirt to scatter along the pathway. Now the vultures, full and gorged, adorned the bare trees, and beneath their resting places lay the white, picked bones of the dead cattle. Those in the trees stared arrogantly at the passing vehicle, and those on the ground merely waddled out of the way. They were the kings of the bush, and would remain so throughout this long year of no rain and no crops. They passed a few empty drinking pools in the bush, and around these were scattered the carcasses of the tiny wild buck. Hundreds had gathered at their favorite drinking places, because about this time every year storm clouds brooded on the horizon, and the rain fell down in blinding sheets of water, and the scene changed overnight into carpets of fine green grass, and splashes of purple and yellow flowers, and the drinking pools filled up with sky-blue water. The memory of all this drove them to the drinking pools, where they died. The cattlemen had a similar memory. Towards the end of the long dry season they too left their watering places along the river beds, and moved with their cattle into the bush, where the grass grew in tangled confusion under the trees, and watered their cattle in the drinking pools of the wild buck. A few of the cattlemen, expecting rain at any time, had deviated towards these water pools on the journey homeward, only to have their huge herds fall down there and die. It happened over and over in Botswana that year. Long before they reached Paulina's cattle post, they saw the vultures circling around it in the sky. This marked it out right away as one of the death points. Once they drew close, they could see that not a living thing moved on the ground. All those 80 cattle lay scattered about, quite still, quite dead. It was like the final statement of all the terrible story of the bush. But there was still hope in the heart of the mother. She somehow expected her son to creep out of the lone and solitary hut, and she knew already how she would comfort him and dismiss all this as being of no account. So no one moved once Gilbert had stopped the car some 20 yards from the hut, and each person sat silently absorbing the desolate scene until the vultures began swooping down in a straight column on the already decomposing carcasses. This jerked the woman into action, and she scrambled out of the car and raced towards the hut. But Micaiah reached the door before her, and pulled her back, and looked at her briefly with an angry expression. What was inside there was only for him to see. He pushed open the door and looked in. There was only a heap of clean, white bones lying on the floor. They lay in a curled, cramped position, with the bones of the hands curved inward. The white ants and maggots had vied with each other to clear all the flesh off the little boy. And Micaiah stood there so silent and still, absorbing this terrible sight, confused and angry, that there was only this dead, unanswering silence in his heart, as though he had expected to see such sights. Paulina touched him on the back, and he swung around sharply with an expression of hurt surprise on his face. "The boy is dead," he said sharply. "Why do you want to go in?" "I must see the body," she said, but with dry, taut lips. "I must see the body because it is our custom." "You see," he said in a deliberately hard voice. "All these rotten customs are killing us. Can't you see I'm here to bear all your burdens? Come on." And he walked towards the car, knowing she would meekly follow him. He stood nearby and waited until she had climbed in. Then he turned, almost with relief, to Gilbert, who sat at the wheel of the car with an ashen face. "Is the boy dead too?" Gilbert asked. "Yes," Micaiah said shortly, and he had no idea that the hurt expression was still on his face. It was like having a smudge there and not knowing you had it. As though, Gilbert thought, he wanted to feel for everyone and get the matter over with. A small light of friendship and understanding stirred in Gilbert's eyes, and sensing this, Micaiah spoke so trustingly to him. "We don't know what's caused the death of the child, my friend," he said. "So we will have to call the police. Could you please take my wife home and notify the police at the same time? I'll remain behind." These few simple words put new life into Gilbert. He nodded briefly and turned the car round, and he and Paulina drove back in the direction of Cholamamimidi. Micaiah was left alone with the vultures. Surrounded by tragedy, and seated in the shade of a ramshackle mud hut in the Botswana bush, he began to see himself. In retrospect, he seemed a small-minded man. All his life he wanted some kind of utopia, and he had rejected in his mind and heart a world full of ailments and faults. He had run and run away from it, but now the time had come when he could run and hide no longer, and would have to turn round and face all the things he had run from. Loving one woman had brought him to this realization, that it was only people who could bring the real rewards of living, that it was only people who could give love and happiness. As though to confirm his new trend of thought, he stirred a foot and found it brushed against a bundle of something, carefully tied up. He opened the bundle, and in it was a collection of wood carvings, done by the small boy to occupy himself during the lonely hours of cattle herding. Among the assortment he picked up a thick porridge bowl, 1½ feet in length. A great deal of effort had been put into the production of this spoon. The small boy had probably intended it to be a gift for his mother. He had decorated the long handle with the twisting pattern of a snake's scaly body, and almost every detail, right up to the venomous eyes, had been reproduced. The design was bold and vivid, and had been burnt into the wood with a red-hot piece of iron. Micaiah looked at it for some time, struggling to capture a living image of a child he did not know. He hoped he and Paulina would never create a child who would be expected to carry burdens beyond his age. All the other carvings concerned themselves with the animals the small boy had observed in his surroundings: wild bucks, tortoises, monkeys, and birds. The birds were carved into a majestic charcoal boat, and 6 of them sat tail to tail with their heads in the air like kings. One carving in particular aroused Micaiah's curiosity. The piece of wood was not more than 6 inches in length, and half of the grain was a livid flesh color and the other was snow white. Out of this the boy had carved a minute crocodile, with the same attention to detail as the snake design. Where had the boy seen a crocodile? There were none along the eastern border area where the cattle grazed, and the surrounding area was a thorn-bush forest, and the tiny piece of wood was a foreigner to the area. He bent to tie up the bundle, and the slight clatter of wood against wood made him look up at a comical drama that was playing out barely 6 inches away from him. A wild jackal had been swiftly approaching the graveyard of cattle, and, thinking himself alone with the vultures, had concentrated his whole mind on the forthcoming meal. The unexpected noise brought him to a dead halt, and his first reaction was one of abject fear. Looking neither left nor right, he almost slunk into the ground, and then, a moment later, lifted one right paw in pathetic, pitiful apology, at the same time baring his sharp, jagged teeth in a savage snarl. Since the snarl went unchallenged, the poor thing quickly recovered itself, and swiveled its foxy face in Micaiah's direction. The sun was behind the jackal, but as he turned, its reflection shone in his beautiful amber eyes in honey-gold flashes. He had a soft, thick honey-gold coat, too, with a contrasting streak of silver and black fur down his back. He stood for a few seconds, eyeing Micaiah fearfully, and then turned and bounded away into the bush. It occurred to Micaiah that a wild animal was more afraid of man than a man need be of it, and its one thought was to retreat as far from man as possible. It seemed to him that in essence most of his reactions had been like those of the jackal, from the day he had been born. For some time his mouth quivered with amusement at the strange antics of the wild animal. Maybe that panic-stricken beast had a jackal society, where he felt sane and secure, but no human society was sane and normal. Yet he needed to come to terms with his society because he needed a woman and children. He could not go on thinking of the heap of bones that lay inside the hut, because death was like trying to clutch the air, and you had to let it be and slowly let it pass aside, without fuss and indignity. Instead, you had to concentrate the mind on all that was still alive and treat it as the most precious treasure you had ever been given. Besides, he had felt all the pain he was capable of feeling the night before, and it had directed his actions along this new path. So he sat there thinking about his new life with Paulina. Even ordinary things like cups, brooms, pots, and houses were a pleasure for him to contemplate, once he had become aware of their existence, as though all these things would anchor him firmly to the earth. They also strengthened his resolve to be a future millionaire, for many a future millionaire must have had a dead child in his life who had died from lack of proper food, and he must have had a one-room hut in which he could hardly move and breathe. He must have lain awake at night, craving a 4-room house with a kitchen, bathroom, and taps, and mentally clothed his house with ornaments, chairs, and beds, and he must have said he would always spend £5, but get £10 back as change. If a man didn't have dreams like this in Africa, he would end up food for the vultures too. These horrible creatures guzzled and guzzled, seeming to have bottomless appetites. The wind swept huge columns of sand up into the sky, which carried the odor of death with it and brought more vultures, in thick black patrols. They swooped down with their big wings outstretched like supersonic jets. Some of the fully gorged birds made way for the newcomers, flying up into the thorn trees and adorning the bare branches in monstrous, silent, carved postures. Even the wind blew according to its own mad pattern. For hours tiny gusts flew in harassed circles around the thorn bush until they all converged in a roaring turmoil of air and red dust, which would race madly for a mile or so along the earth and then swept up and dispersed itself in the sky. Micaiah stood up at last, sickened by the ceaseless clack of the vultures' beaks. Away from the little hut and the vultures was the endless, dead vista of scorched earth and twisted dry thorn bush. He leaned against a dead tree and closed his eyes, all his capacity for thought slowly seeping out of him. This bush on all sides was the most awful life imaginable, and it occurred to Micaiah that it must have been this unrelieved, heavy isolation which had driven the lively-minded Dinarego out of the cattle business. Yet thousands of people lived like this, like trees, in all the lonely wastes of Africa, cut off even from communication with their own selves. Was it any wonder that life stood still if a man became a tree? Therefore he, Micaiah, could run so far in search of peace, but it was contact with other living beings that a man needed most. Maybe even utopias were just trees. Maybe. Maybe he walked around in hopeless circles, but at least he was attempting to reach up to a life beyond the morass in which all black men lived. Most men were waiting for the politicians to sort out their private agonies. At this point he ceased thinking altogether, and the sun passed its topmost peak in the sky and began sinking towards the horizon. At about 3 o'clock Gilbert returned with the police officer, George Appleby Smith, and a doctor. Micaiah sat in the car, drinking a little water and eating food which Gilbert had brought along, while the policeman and the doctor made their reports. Gilbert also sat in the car, but kept silent too. Eventually the doctor came out of the hut and walked towards the car. "I'd say the poor fellow died of malnutrition," he said. He kept quiet a moment, screwed up his eyes, and looked away. The hospitals were full of children who had died in the posture of the little boy in the hut, their knees cramped up to their chins, their bony fingers curled into their palms like steel claws. Most of these children who survived would be mental defectives or cripples. while this little boy had mercifully died. "The policeman wants to know if it's all right to bury the boy here," he added quietly. Only Micaiah moved. "I'll accept responsibility for that," he said. He turned round and picked up a small can of petrol, jumped out of the car, and walked to the hut. George Appleby Smith stood in the dark hut, staring at the little heap of bones, with an expressionless face. All these sights were supposed to be all in a day's work for him, but he stored these experiences away to give him the courage to run his area the way he thought it ought to be run, even to befriending security risks like Micaiah. All those authorities had kicked up such a dust about his allowing a security risk to settle in Cholamamimidi, but they never had occasion to come out into the bush and see how children died, while he, George, saw everything, every day. He turned towards Micaiah with one of those very rare smiles. "Hello, Micaiah," he said. "You settling down?" "You still sticking your neck out for me?" Micaiah countered, also smiling. Micaiah bent and poured a little petrol over the heap of bones, struck a match, and within a few seconds converted the pathetic sight into ashes. Then he scooped up the ashes into a small container, which was lying in a corner of the hut. There was not a trace of the agony and fright in which the little boy must have died. Apart from the tin container, the little boy's bedding, a bag of ant-riddled sorghum meal, and a badly burned porridge pot, there was nothing else in the hut. They took with them only the tin container and the tied-up bundle outside the hut. It was long past sundown when they arrived in the village of Cholamamimidi. Even George Appleby Smith had nothing to say. Droughts and dead children made him lose his sense of humor, and he got into his own car with the doctor and drove away. Maria walked quickly into the yard in her aloof, serious way. The whole village knew by now that Paulina's child had died, and they were all in her yard, not talking, but just sitting in heavy, silent groups, like the trees. Micaiah suddenly could not bear this most exacting of all African customs, not just then, not with his emotional involvement with Paulina. He handed the tin container to Maria. "Please take this to Polly," he said. "Tell her I thought it was best to burn what was left of the child." Gilbert walked with his wife to the home of Paulina, but Micaiah walked to his own hut, still clutching the tied-up bundle of wooden carvings, and dropped on the bed in a deep and dreamless sleep. An hour later Maria knocked on the door. She had a tray with food and a cup of tea. There was silence inside the hut, so she pushed the door open and walked in, setting the tray down on the table. She stood looking down with a slight smile on the sleeping man. Being an African man, he ought to have known that nothing happened on the continent of Africa without all Africans getting to know of it. In some mysterious way, the news had travelled around the village of Cholamamimidi that Micaiah had spent the previous night at Paulina's home, even though Paulina had made no mention of it to anyone. God knows what they expected of the poor man, but it had added a twist of drama to an everyday event of mourning a death, which event everyone had to participate in. People were genuinely sorry for the bereaved Paulina, but they soon forgot it when only Maria and Gilbert turned up for the show with the remains of the dead child in a tin container. A lively titter of whispering started, and Maria heard it all, silly things that would keep women twittering for days. If you can't face a crowd, you must be a person who hates people, irrespective of a lifetime of individual deeds of kindness to individual people. That's why deviationists and independent-minded people were so few in Africa, but it wasn't because of the crowd that she awoke Micaiah. They had dispersed and gone their way by now. It was because of Paulina, and the way she blamed herself for the death of her child in a quiet, final, and despairing way, without the usual tears or hysterics. She kept on looking at everyone with that haughty stare, as much to say, "Why don't you all go away?" Only Ma Millipede suspected that this quiet attitude meant that Paulina might try to kill herself, and she had confided this aside to Maria, and had said that she would remain behind, even for the whole night if necessary. Maria bent and shook the sleeping man awake. "Have some food," she said in a kind and gentle voice, because she was sorry, in her personal and private way, for everyone's suffering. Since she hesitated, he turned to this twin soul of privacy and isolation and asked, "Do you know what I saw today, Maria?" "No," she said curiously. "Even the trees were dying, from the roots upward," he said. "Does everything die like this?" "No," she said. "You may see no rivers on the ground, but we keep the rivers inside us. That is why all good things and all good people are called rain. Sometimes we see the rain clouds gather even though not a cloud appears in the sky. It is all in our heart." He nodded his head, fully grasping this in its deepest meaning. There was always something on this earth man was forced to love and worship by reason of its absence. People in cloudy, misty climates worshipped the sun, and people in semi-desert countries worshipped the rain. "Paulina is blaming herself for the death of the child," she added softly, frightened at involving herself in the feelings of this sensitive man. "I knew she would," he said, and paused in his eating and looked up at her. "I couldn't say anything about it with everyone there. Have they gone away?" "Yes, but Ma Millipede is still there." He put the unfinished plate of food on the tray and stood up, waiting for her to pick up the tray and leave the hut. Then he blew out the candle and picked up the bundle of wooden carvings. "What a way for you to come home, little boy," he whispered, and stepped out into the dark night. The wind had died down, and the stars shone down in the low, black sky with full green lights. The stars were always there to accompany a man's lonely footsteps. They had been with him on the night he first arrived in Botswana, and they were like sprays of flowers between the narrow, grim streets of the slums in which he had grown up. They would be there too after he had passed away, and they were all the conviction he had that some quiet and good creator controlled and owned the earth. Ma Millipede was saying much the same thing to Paulina. They sat out in the yard, near a bonfire of logs which the men of the village had lit as a sign of death in the house. He stood for a moment outside the range of the firelight and listened to the murmur of Ma Millipede's voice. Not only Jesus Christ had observed this, but Ma Millipede too, that this earth was not the final abode of man. It was a place of sorrows, a wilderness in which his soul wandered in restless torment. The soul had to accept this, but the young woman whom she so wisely counselled drooped her head and arms forlornly to the ground. No words, however wise, could explain the awfulness of death, not while the living were firmly attached to love, childbearing, child-rearing, hunger, struggle, and the sunrise of tomorrow. Life had to flow all the time for the living, like water in a stream. Micaiah held it in his hand. It was the little bundle of wood carvings. Yet he stood where he was until the two women slowly became aware of his presence. "Micaiah!" Paulina exclaimed, jumping up and rushing towards the faint outline of his white shirt. "Oh, why did you take so long to come?" she cried brokenly, and a torrent of hot tears spilled on his shirt like a small waterfall. He slipped one free arm around her thin, bony waist. "Aren't you glad I've come now? Don't cry. I've brought you something." But even when she had untied the bundle near the firelight with trembling fingers, this small waterfall continued to drench her arms and blouse and shirt. Ma Millipede had to join in, too, with long, slow teardrops and many "pathos," while they examined the carvings one by one. After a time, Micaiah could see that they were actually laughing in spite of those tears, because they both knew the boy, with his oversized scarecrow coat and big smile. They saw how he had killed a snake in the bush, brought it back to the hut, and carefully copied the patterns of its body on the wooden handle of a porridge spoon. But the handwork on the little crocodile was different from the small boy's rough strokes. It had the smooth, polished finish of an old professional hunter and a wood carver, and such a man had passed by the small boy's cattle post one day and exchanged his own professional work for that of a cheerful little boy. And what other way was there to mourn the death of such a boy? Micaiah liked it this way, for he imagined the small boy the way he had been, standing quite close by and observing it. It made his heart feel very peaceful. It reminded Ma Millipede that her back was aching and she was very tired. He stood up and accompanied Ma Millipede all the way to her home, her tired feet shuffling quietly on the path beside him. She sighed deeply to herself in an absent-minded way, but as they were about to part company, she said, "Well, I say, my son, this is a world full of sorrows." "Yes," he said. But in spite of agreeing with Ma Millipede, his heart continued to feel peaceful. Perhaps he would have the courage to make children in such a world. For in this kind of lull, from the inner torture of his life, he could think clearly. He was just an ordinary man, and he wanted to stay that way all his life. None of the tinsel and glitter of the world attracted him, but just what there was to live on and make do with in a village like Hulamamimidi. They were going to start shooting up everything one day, and George Appleby Smith would come to him and say, "I'm sorry, but the government wants you to leave because you're security risk." And you wouldn't know what they meant by that, because Africa was your country, and there was no place else where a black man would come into his own and eventually lift up his head with dignity. Perhaps the whole world would still pretend not to understand your state of mind. "We're morality," they'll say. "For God's sake, stop the slaughter. We're on your side. We're morality, and we're on your side." But in the meanwhile he walked back to a firelight in the Botswana bush, with these unending tortures stilled for a bit. He hoped to find out something, because there were too many riddles and ironies these days, even in the African bush. He understood a man like Gilbert perfectly, as though life never did anything haphazardly, but prepared people for their friends and threw them together at the right moment for some more obscure purpose than building dams, tobacco cooperatives, and cattle feeding grounds. Maybe he would not survive with his security risk status, but the world would not rid itself of African men. He would always be there, but not any longer as the white man's joke, as his money, or his K, or his boy.